Before there was soil or sky or any green thing, there was only the gaping abyss of Ginnungagap. This chaos of perfect silence and darkness lay between the homeland of elemental fire, Muspelheim, and the homeland of elemental ice, Niflheim. Frost from Niflheim and billowing flames from Muspelheim crept toward each other until they met in Ginnungagap. Amid the hissing and sputtering, the fire melted the ice, and the drops formed themselves into Ymir, the first of the godlike but destructive giants. Ymir was a hermaphrodite and could reproduce asexually. When he slept, more giants leapt forth from his legs and from the sweat of his armpits. As the frost continued to melt, a cow, Audhumla, emerged from it. She nourished Ymir with her milk, and she, in turn, was nourished by salt licks in the ice. Her licks slowly uncovered Buri, the first of the Aesir tribe of gods. Buri had a son named Bor, who married Bestla, the daughter of the giant Bolthorn. The half-god, half-giant children of Bor and Bestla were Odin, who became the chief of the Aesir gods, and his two brothers Vili and Ve. Odin and his brothers slew Ymir and set about constructing the world from his corpse. They fashioned the oceans from his blood, the soil from his skin and muscles, vegetation from his hair, clouds from his brains, and the sky from his skull. 4 dwarves, corresponding to the 4 cardinal points, held Ymir's skull aloft above the earth. The gods eventually formed the first man and woman, Ask and Embla, from 2 tree trunks and built a fence around their dwelling place, Midgard, to protect them from the giants. One day Loki the trickster found himself in an especially mischievous mood and cut off the gorgeous golden hair of Sif, the wife of Thor. When Thor learned of this, his quick temper was enraged, and he seized Loki and threatened to break every bone in his body. Loki pleaded with the thunder god to let him go down to Svartalfheim, the cavernous home of the dwarves, and see if those master craftspeople could fashion a new head of hair for Sif, this one even more beautiful than the original. Thor allowed this, and off Loki went to Svartalfheim. There he was able to obtain what he desired. The sons of the dwarf Ivaldi forged not only a new head of hair for Sif, but also 2 other marvels, Skidbladnir, the best of all ships, which always has a favorable wind and can be folded up and put into one's pocket, and Hrungnir, the deadliest of all spears. Having accomplished his task, Loki was overcome by an urge to remain in the caves of the dwarves and revel in more recklessness. He approached the brothers Brokkr and Sindri and taunted them, saying that he was sure the brothers could never forge 3 new creations equal to those the sons of Ivaldi had fashioned. In fact, he even bet his head on their lack of ability. Brokkr and Sindri, however, accepted the wager. As they worked, a fly, who, of course, was none other than Loki in disguise, stung Sindri's hand. When the dwarf pulled his creation out of the fire, it was a living boar with golden hair. This was Gullinbursti, who gave off light in the dark and could run better than any horse, even through water or air. Sindri then set another piece of gold on the fire as Brokkr worked the bellows. The fly bit Brokkr on the neck, and Sindri drew out a magnificent ring, Draupnir. From this ring, every 9th night, fall 8 new golden rings of equal weight. Sindri then put iron on the hearth and told Brokkr that for this next working, they must be especially meticulous, for a mistake would be more costly than with the previous 2 projects. Loki immediately stung Brokkr's eyelid, and the blood blocked the dwarf's eye, preventing him from properly seeing his work. Sindri produced a hammer of unsurpassed quality which never missed its mark and would boomerang back to its owner after being thrown. But it had one flaw. The handle was short. Sindri lamented that this had almost ruined the piece, which was called Mjolnir. Nevertheless, sure of the great worth of their 3 treasures, Sindri and Brokkr made their way to Asgard to claim the wages that were due to them. Loki made it to the halls of the gods before the dwarves and presented the marvels he had acquired. To Thor he gave Sif's new hair and the hammer Mjolnir. To Odin went the ring Draupnir and the spear Gungnir. And Freya was the happy recipient of Skidbladnir and Gullinbursti. As grateful as the gods were to receive these gifts, especially Mjolnir, which they foresaw would be of inestimable help in their battles against the giants, they nevertheless concluded that Loki still owed the dwarves his head. When the dwarves approached Loki with knives, the cunning god pointed out that he had promised them his head, but not his neck. Brokkr and Sindri contented themselves with sewing Loki's mouth shut and returned to their forge.
At the center of the Norse cosmos stands the great tree Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil's upper branches cradle Asgard, the home and fortress of the Aesir gods and goddesses of whom Odin is the chief. Yggdrasil grows out of the Well of Erd, a pool whose fathomless depths hold many of the most powerful forces and beings in the cosmos. Among these beings are the Norns, three sagacious maidens who create the fates of all beings. One of the foremost techniques they use to shape fate is carving runes into Yggdrasil's trunk. The symbols then carry these intentions throughout the tree, affecting everything in the 9 worlds. Odin watched the Norns from his seat in Asgard and envied their powers and their wisdom, and he bent his will toward the task of coming to know the runes. Since the runes' native home is in the Well of Erd with the Norns, and since the runes do not reveal themselves to any but those who prove themselves worthy of such fearful insights and abilities, Odin hung himself from a branch of Yggdrasil, pierced himself with his spear, and peered downward into the shadowy waters below. He forbade any of the other gods to grant him the slightest aid, not even a sip of water. And he stared downward and called to the runes. He survived in this state, teetering on the precipice that separates the living from the dead for no less than 9 days and nights. At the end of the 9th night, he at last perceived shapes in the depths, the runes. They had accepted his sacrifice and shown themselves to him, revealing to him not only their forms, but also the secrets that lie within them. Having fixed this knowledge in his formidable memory, Odin ended his ordeal with a scream of exultation.
Then I was fertilized and became wise. I truly grew and thrived. From a word to a word I was led to a word. From a work to a work I was led to a work.
Equipped with the knowledge of how to wield the runes, he became one of the mightiest and most accomplished beings in the cosmos. He learned chants that enabled him to heal emotional and bodily wounds, and to perform many other feats like these.
3 of the Aesir gods, Odin, Loki and Hrungnir, were on a journey that took them through desolate mountains far from Asgard. Food was scarce in this uninviting region, so when the travelers came upon a herd of oxen, they slaughtered one for their dinner. When they put the meat over their fire, however, it didn't cook, no matter how long they left it there. Perplexed by this, they heard a voice addressing them from above. Looking up, they saw a very large eagle perched on a nearby branch. "It is I," he said, "who by my magic prevent your catch from cooking. But if you will give me my fill of the meat, then I shall release the remainder from my spell." The gods, though irritated, agreed, and the eagle flew down and took for himself the choicest portions of the ox. Loki thought this to be beyond the terms of their bargain, and in anger took up a sturdy branch and lunged at the eagle. The eagle snatched the branch in his talons and, with the bewildered Loki still clinging to the other end, flew up high into the sky. The terrified god begged the eagle to release him, but the eagle, who was none other than Thiazi the giant in disguise, refused to do so until Loki swore an oath to bring him Idun and her fruits. When the trio made it back to Asgard at the conclusion of their travels, Loki went to Idun and told her that he had found fruits even more marvelous than her own, growing in a forest beyond the walls of Asgard, and that she should follow him there and bring her own apples for comparison. Idun followed the trickster, and when she reached the wood she was borne up by Thiazi in his eagle form and taken away to the giant's abode. This place was called Thrymheim, and was situated in the highest mountain peaks whose icy towers growled down at the fertile fields below. In Idun's absence, the gods and goddesses felt old age creeping up on them. Their skin became wrinkled, their hair greyed, and their vigor waned. When they assembled together and asked one another about the circumstances under which Idun was last seen, It was reported that the last sighting of her had been with Loki as the two left Asgard together. Then they seized Loki and threatened him with all manner of pains if he didn't tell them what had happened to the fair goddess. Loki spilled his story, and the gods informed him that if he couldn't rescue Idun from Thiazi, he would be put to death. Freya lent him her hawk feathers, with which one can shift his or her shape into that of a hawk, and he flew off to Jotunheim, the homeland of the giants, within which Thrymheim was located. When he came to Thrymheim, he found, to his great delight, that Thiazi had gone out to sea to fish, leaving Idun home alone. Without losing a minute, Loki turned the goddess into a nut and sped away with her in his talons. When Thiazi returned and found his prize missing, he assumed his eagle form and filled the air with the thunderous beats of his wings on his way toward Asgard in pursuit of Loki. By the time the god was in sight of his home, the giant was close behind him and furiously closing the gap. When Loki's companions caught sight of the chase, they built a pile of kindling around their fortress. Loki, still clutching Idun, made it across the barrier, and then the gods lit the fire, and it exploded so rapidly that Thiazi didn't have time to turn around before entering the flames, and that was the end of his flight. This tale begins where the kidnapping of Idun ends. While the gods were celebrating their slaying of the giant Thiazi and the return of the youth-giving goddess Idun to their halls, an unannounced visitor stormed into their merrymaking. This was the giantess Skadi, who had arrived with armor and weapons to avenge the death of Thiazi, her father. The gods were patient with her and convinced her to accept reparations instead of seeking vengeance. These reparations came in three parts. First, Odin took Thiazi's eyes and ceremoniously cast them into the night sky, where they became 2 stars. Second, the gods were to make Skadi laugh. After many feats were tried, none succeeded in bringing a smile to the grim face of the giantess. At last, Loki tied one end of a rope to a goat, and the other end around his testicles, and began a game of tug-of-war with the goat. Each screeched and howled in turn, until at last Loki fell over into Skadi's lap. The giantess couldn't help but chuckle. Third, Skadi was to be given a god of her choosing in marriage, but she was to select him by the sight of his legs and feet alone. She picked the fairest pair of legs she could see, thinking them to be those of Baldur. However, as it turned out, they were those of the sea god Njord. After Skadi and Njord's magnificent wedding, it came time for the couple to decide where to live. Njord's home was Noatun, a bright, warm place on the beach. Skadi's home couldn't have been more different. It was Thrymheim, a dark, foreboding place in the highest mountain peaks where the snow never melts. The pair first spent 9 nights in Thrymheim. When this time had passed and they made their way down from the mountains, Njord declared that, although brief, his time in Thrymheim had been loathsome. He had been particularly dismayed by the sounds of the wolves, to which he overwhelmingly preferred the songs of the swans to which he was accustomed. After the two had slept for 9 nights in Noatun, Skadi had similar opinions to express regarding the sunny home of Njord. The cries of the seabirds had been unbearably abrasive to her ears, and she had found it impossible to sleep. So she departed for the mountains, and the two parted ways. The Norse pseudo-god Loki, who is by turns the friend and the enemy of the other gods, had 3 fearfully hideous and strong children with the giantess Angerboda. The first was the serpent Jormungand, and the second was the death goddess Hel. The third was the wolf Fenrir. The gods had terrible forebodings concerning the fate of these 3 beings, and they were absolutely correct. Jormungand would later kill the god Thor during Ragnarok, the downfall of the cosmos, an event which would be largely brought about by Hel's refusal to release the radiant god Baldur from the underworld. During these cataclysmic events, Fenrir would devour Odin, the chief of the gods. In order to keep these monsters at bay, they threw Jomungun into the ocean, where he encircled Midgard, the world of humankind. Hell they relegated to the underworld. Fenrir, however, inspired too much fear in them for them to let him out from under their watchful eyes. So they reared the pup themselves in their stronghold Asgard. Only Tyr, the indefatigable upholder of law and honor, dared to approach Fenrir to feed him. Fenrir grew at an alarming rate, however, and soon the gods decided that his stay in Asgard had to be temporary. Knowing well how much devastation he would cause if he were allowed to roam free, the gods attempted to bind him with various chains. They were able to gain the wolf's consent by telling him that these fetters were tests of his strength, and clapping and cheering when, with each new chain they presented him, he broke free. At last, the gods sent a messenger down to Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves. The dwarves, being the most skilled craftspeople in the cosmos, were able to forge a chain whose strength couldn't be equaled. It was wrought from the sound of a cat's footsteps, the beard of a woman, the roots of mountains, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. In other words, things which don't exist, and against which it's therefore futile to struggle. Gleipnir, open, was its name. When the gods presented Fenrir with the curiously light and supple Gleipnir, the wolf suspected trickery and refused to be bound with it unless one of the gods would lay his or her hand in his jaws as a pledge of good faith. None of the gods agreed, knowing that this would mean the loss of a hand and the breaking of an oath. At last, the brave Tyr, for the good of all life, volunteered to fulfill the wolf's demand. And sure enough, when Fenrir discovered that he was unable to escape from Gleipnir, he chomped off and swallowed Tyr's hand. The fettered beast was then transported to some suitably lonely and desolate place. The chain was tied to a boulder and a sword was placed in the wolf's jaws to hold them open. As he howled wildly and ceaselessly, a foamy river called Expectation flowed from his drooling mouth. And there in that sordid state he remained until Ragnarok. While Thor and Loki were traveling far from Asgard in Thor's goat-drawn chariot, night overtook them, and they were welcomed into the house of a farmer and his family. To repay his hosts for their hospitality, Thor offered his goats for supper, knowing that he could bring them back to life afterwards and not be at any loss. Despite the thunder god's instructions, Thialfi broke open one of the goat's leg bones to suck out the marrow before placing it on the hide with the others. When Thor awoke the following morning, he hallowed the goat hides and bones with his hammer, whereupon the goats sprang back to life. One of them, however, had a lame hind leg. Thor immediately intuited the reason for this and was so furious at the farmer and his family that he would have slain them all on the spot had the farmer not offered him his children, Thialfi and Röskva, to be his servants. Thor accepted, and he, Loki, and the children pressed onward on foot, leaving the handicapped goats behind. The party's goal was to reach Jotunheim, the land of the giants. Just as night was falling, they came to a huge hall. They found no one inside, and decided to spend the night there. They were jostled awake by a great earthquake. Running outside, they found a sleeping giant whose snores caused the earth to rumble and shake. Thor, who hated giants, clutched his hammer and resolved to smite this sure foe of his. But the giant awoke at the last second and seemed to be cheered, or at least amused, by the sight of Thor and his companions. The giant introduced himself as Hrungnir, but said that he already knew full well to whom he was introducing himself. Hrungnir picked up his glove, the great hall in which Thor and his company had slept during the night, and proposed that he accompany them on their journey. To this the god agreed, and off they went through forests and over hills. Hrungnir had been carrying all of their provisions in his bag, and when the giant fell asleep, and the task of opening the bag fell to Thor, the god found himself unable to untie the giant's knots. This so angered Thor that he struck the dozing Hrungnir in the forehead, hoping to kill him. The giant awoke calmly and asked if a leaf had fallen on his head. Later in the night, the giant's snores grew so loud they echoed through the valleys like thunder. Thor, annoyed by his inability to sleep and wanting to kill the giant anyway, tried a second time to smite him by striking him in the head. But, much as before, Hrungnir awakened and asked if an acorn had fallen on his head. Just before dawn, Thor decided to try one more time to end Hrungnir's life. But the giant, awakened, asked if some birds had roosted above him and shaken some dirt from the branches onto his face. Hrungnir departed from Thor and his companions, and the company pressed onward toward a castle called Utgard. Around midday, the travelers reached their destination. The gate was locked and no one was there to open it, but Thor and the others found that they could fit through the very large spaces between the bars of the gate easily enough. Once inside, they found a hall where men sat eating and drinking. Amongst them was the king of this castle, the giant Utgarder Loki, who immediately recognized his new guests and set about taunting them for their diminutive size. Wanting to salvage his dignity and that of his companions, Loki proudly asserted that no one else in this castle could eat food faster than he could. Utgarder Loki challenged him to prove this boast by entering a contest with one of the men there, whose name was Logi. They met in the middle at the same time, but while Loki had eaten all of the meat between the end and the middle, Logi had eaten the meat, the bones, and even the trough itself. Loki had clearly lost. Thjalfi, who was an extremely swift runner, then offered to race anyone in the castle. By the time Hugi reached the finish line, he was so far ahead of Thjalfi that he doubled back to meet his contestant. Thor then challenged anyone in the castle to a drinking contest, something at which he had no little skill. Thor drank mightily, but by the time he had to pause for a breath, the level of liquor in the horn had barely lowered. So he gave it a second try, straining to gulp and gulp until his breath failed him. His third drink was even more formidable than the previous two, but in the end much was still left. By that point, however, Thor couldn't drink any more and gave up.
Well then, Thor, shall we test your legendary strength?
The giant king, cunning and sly, proposes a series of challenges to test the god's strength. First, Thor is tasked with lifting the king's cat, a seemingly simple feat for one so strong. But the thunder god strains and struggles, barely able to raise a single paw from the ground. Frustrated by his failure, Thor demands a contest of wrestling to prove his might.
Very well, you shall wrestle her.
Utgarder Loki presents an old woman as Thor's opponent, much to the god's indignation. Yet, to his shock and dismay, the frail-looking adversary brings him to his knees with ease. Humiliated and angry, Thor and his companions spend an uneasy night in the giant's castle. As dawn breaks, after Utgarder Loki had shown them out of the castle, he confided to them what had actually transpired in their contests, saying to Thor, "Now that you have left my castle, I shall see to it that you never enter it again. The knot on my provision bag that you almost succeeded in untying had been wrought in iron. I deflected the blows you attempted to inflict on me with your hammer. Instead of my face, you hit the mountainside and carved 3 gaping valleys into it. Had you struck me, I would have been killed then and there." Loki held his own remarkably well in his eating contest, since his opponent was none other than fire itself. So it was with Thjalfi too. He raced against thought which nobody could ever hope to outrun. The far end of the horn from which you drank was connected to the sea, and we were actually greatly afraid that you were going to drink it all. When you cross over the sea again, you will see how much you have lowered its level. The cat Thor could barely lift was, in fact, the Midgard serpent, encircling the entire world. In raising its paw, Thor had lifted the great beast so high that it nearly touched the sky.
And your wrestling opponent?
And the old woman who bested him in wrestling? She was Ellie, the embodiment of old age itself. Utgard Loki confesses that he used illusions to deceive the god, fearing Thor's true power. In his anger, Thor raises his hammer to smite the trickster for this humiliating deception. But as he turns to strike, he finds the castle and its inhabitants have vanished into thin air. Thus, the god of thunder learns a valuable lesson, that appearances can be deceiving, even for the most powerful of beings.
In the vast tapestry of Norse mythology, where gods and giants walk the earth, there unfolds a tale of unprecedented scale, a fishing trip that would shake the very foundations of the world. Picture, if you will, the great hall of Asgard, home to the mighty Ymir. Here, plans were afoot for a feast of legendary proportions. But such a gathering required a vessel of immense size to brew mead for all the guests. Only one being in all the 9 worlds possessed such a cauldron, the giant Ymir. Enter Thor, son of Odin, wielder of Mjolnir. With his characteristic bravado, he volunteered for this perilous quest. Observe as Thor journeys across treacherous landscapes, his red beard whipping in the wind, determination etched on his face. At last he arrives at Hymir's abode, a structure hewn from the very mountains themselves. But Thor's legendary appetite would soon strain the hospitality of his reluctant host. Witness the giant's shock as Thor devours not 1 but 2 whole bulls in a single sitting, bones crunching between his teeth. Come morning, Ymir declared they must fish for their next meal. As dawn broke, Thor sought bait for their expedition. His choice? The head of Hymir's prized bull, torn from its body with godly strength. Hymir's anger simmered as they pushed out to sea, his usual fishing grounds their apparent destination. But Thor had other plans. Watch as he rose further and further from shore, each powerful stroke taking them closer to the domain of a creature of legend. Hymir's unease grows palpable. In these waters dwells a beast of unimaginable size, Jormungand, the world serpent. Thor's eyes gleam with anticipation. This is no mere fishing trip, but a chance to face his greatest foe. The god casts his line into the depths. The sea grows still, as if the very waters hold their breath. Suddenly, a tug. Not the gentle nibble of a fish, but a pull that threatens to drag Thor himself into the abyss. Thor's face contorts with effort and fierce joy as he begins to heave. The battle between god and serpent has begun. The boat rocks violently, waves crashing over its sides. Ymir cowers, his face a mask of terror, but Thor stands firm, his feet breaking through the boat's planks, water rushing in around him. From the roiling sea emerges a sight to freeze the blood of even the bravest warrior. The gargantuan head of Jormungand itself, its eyes, ancient and cold, fix upon Thor. Venom drips from its maw, sizzling as it hits the turbulent waters. Thor reaches for Mjolnir, ready to deliver a blow that would echo through eternity. But fate, it seems, had other plans. Ymir, overcome by terror, cuts the line with a desperate swipe of his blade. The serpent, freed from Thor's hook, slips back into the depths with a roar that shakes the heavens. Thor's fury knows no bounds. With a bellow of rage, he hurls the giant overboard, into the very waters that house his escaped prey. Observe as Thor, mighty even in defeat, wades back to shore. The sea itself seems to part before his wrath. With the 2 whales Ymir caught slung over his shoulders, Thor begins his journey back to Asgard. And there, upon his back, rests Hymir's cauldron, the original object of his quest, now a mere afterthought. So ends Thor's great fishing expedition, a tale of gods, giants, and the monsters that dwell in the deep. A reminder that even for the mightiest among us, some prey will always remain just out of reach.
In the realm of Asgard, where gods dwell and legends are born, a crisis was brewing that would test even the mightiest of deities. Thor, the god of thunder, renowned for his strength and bravery, awoke one fateful morning to a shocking discovery. His hammer, Mjolnir, the source of his power and Asgard's greatest defense, had vanished without a trace. Thor's rage coursed through the streets of Asgard, his presence alone causing a stir among the citizens. The loss of this weapon was no small matter. Without it, Asgard lay vulnerable to the threats of giants and other formidable foes. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The goddess Freya lent her magical falcon feathers to aid in the search. Loki, the trickster god known for his cunning and shape-shifting abilities, donned these feathers and set off on a perilous journey. With a final shimmer of magic, Loki took to the skies, his keen eyes searching for any sign of the stolen hammer. There, Loki encountered Thrym, the imposing chieftain of the giants, whose very presence seemed to chill the air around him.
Tell your gods, little bird. Mjolnir is mine, buried deep where they'll never find it. Unless...
But the giant's terms for its return were as audacious as his theft. He demanded the beautiful goddess Freya as his bride. As Thor heard Thrym's outrageous demand, a plan began to form in his mind, one that would require cunning, bravery, and perhaps a touch of the ridiculous. Loki returned to Asgard with this alarming news, sending the gods into a frenzy of debate and dismay. Freya, in particular, was outraged at the very suggestion of such a union. As the gods sat in council, it was Heimdall who proposed a solution both daring and absurd. Thor, the mightiest and most masculine of gods, would disguise himself as Freya to retrieve his hammer and exact vengeance. And so began the most unusual transformation in the history of the Nine Worlds. Thor's muscular frame was draped in layers of fine silk and linen, his beard hidden beneath a delicate veil. Despite the absurdity of his appearance, Thor's eyes blazed with the fire of a warrior, determined to reclaim his stolen hammer at any cost. The unlikely pair set off for Jotunheim in Thor's chariot, drawn by his mighty goats, their journey taking them across the realms of the cosmos, their hooves striking thunder from the clouds. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by Thrym, whose eyes gleamed with triumph and barely concealed desire. But it was here that Thor's disguise faced its greatest test, as his legendary appetite threatened to unravel their carefully crafted deception. The bride-to-be devoured an entire ox, ate salmon, and all the delicacies meant for the women, washing it down with barrels of mead. Loki, ever the quick thinker, realized he needed to act fast to salvage their plan before suspicion grew too great. Thrym's suspicion grew with each bite, his brow furrowing as he watched his supposed bride eat with such unladylike gusto. But Loki, the master of lies, was quick to spin a tale of Freya's week-long fast, driven by her overwhelming desire for Thrym. As was customary, Thrym called for Mjolnir to hallow their union, unknowingly sealing his own fate. The hammer was laid in Thor's lap, and in that instant, the god of thunder underwent a final explosive transformation. Gone was the demure bride, replaced by the wrathful deity in all his terrible glory. Thor's mighty hand clasped Mjolnir's handle, electricity crackling through the air as his true power was unleashed. In a symphony of lightning and thunder, Thor exacted his vengeance, first upon Thrym, then upon all who had dared to mock him. The halls of Jotunheim, once filled with celebratory feasting, now echoed with the sounds of divine retribution. His honor restored and his weapon reclaimed, Thor returned to Asgard, leaving behind a tale that would be told for ages to come. And so, the story of Thor's wedding became legend, a testament to the lengths even gods will go to protect their realm and their pride.
Hrungnir was the mightiest of all of the giants, the spirits of darkness, winter, night, and the grave, who are often the enemies of the gods. One day Hrungnir was paid a visit in Jotunheim, the homeland of the giants, by Odin. Hrungnir didn't recognize the god at first, and instead wondered aloud who this stranger might be whose horse could ride through the air and the water, as he had seen the horse do at the god's approach. Odin bet his head that his horse, none other than the eight-legged shamanic steed, Sleipnir, could outrun any horse in Jotunheim. Hrungnir was insulted by this provocation and straightway accepted the bet and mounted his own horse, Gulfaxi, Golden Mane. Before the giant realized it, he had passed through the gates of Asgard, the home of the gods. The gods, seemingly in good cheer, invited him to drink with them. After he had become drunk, he became belligerent and boasted that he would kill all of the gods except for the Freya and Sif, the wife of Thor. These two lovely goddesses he would carry back to Jotunheim with him. Freya alone was stout of heart enough to continue filling his horn. Next he bellowed that he would drink every last drop of the god's ale. The gods soon grew tired of his anger and sent for Thor, who had been elsewhere fighting other giants. When Thor arrived and discovered the situation, he lifted his hammer and prepared to slay Hrungnir there on the spot. The bellicose, and yet we may suspect, inwardly fearful giant accused Thor of cowardice for intending to kill someone who was himself unarmed. "Your name would be held in far higher honor," the giant declared, "if you will accept my challenge to a duel." Never one to lose an opportunity to gain renown and prove his abilities, Thor accepted. When the arranged time had arrived, Hrungnir walked to the field near Jotunheim where the duel was to be held. He wore stone armor, brandished a stone shield, and menacingly waved a whetstone, his chosen weapon, in the air above him. Suddenly, he saw lightning and heard thunder clap above him, and Thor roared onto the battlefield. Thor hurled his hammer at the giant, and the giant slung his whetstone at the god. The stone burst against Thor's forehead and shattered into pieces, and this is the origin of all flint on earth. Thor's hammer also struck Hrungnir's head, but this time it was the giant's head that was shattered. But a piece of Hrungnir's whetstone was lodged in Thor's forehead. So Thor sought out the sorceress Groa, Thriving, who sang spells over the stone to remove it from the god's brow. When Thor felt the stone moving, he told the sorceress many joyous things to encourage her, chiefly that he had encountered her lost husband, who would soon be home. But Groa was so overcome with emotion upon hearing this that she forgot her chants, and the rock remained lodged in Thor's face until his death at Ragnarok.
Baldur was one of the most beloved of all the gods. The son of Odin, the chief of the gods, and the benevolent sorceress goddess Frigg, Baldur was a generous, joyful and courageous character who gladdened the hearts of all who spent time with him. When therefore he began to have ominous dreams of some grave misfortune befalling him, the fearful gods appointed Odin to discover their meaning. Baldur's father wasted no time in mounting his steed, Sleipnir, and riding to the underworld to consult a dead seeress whom he knew to be especially wise in such matters. When, in one of his countless disguises, he reached the cold and misty underworld, he found the halls arrayed in splendor, as if some magnificent feast were about to occur. Odin woke the seeress and questioned her concerning this festivity, and she responded that the guest of honor was to be none other than Baldur, and indeed all that she prophesied would come to pass. Frigg, yearning for any chance of saving her treasured son, however remote, went to every entity in the cosmos, living or non-living, and obtained oaths to not harm Baldur. After these oaths were secured, the gods made a sport out of the situation. They threw sticks, rocks and anything else on hand at Baldur, and everyone laughed as these things bounced off and left the shining god unharmed. The wily and disloyal Loki sensed an opportunity for mischief.
Did all things swear oaths to spare Baldur from harm?
"Oh yes," the goddess replied, "everything except the mistletoe. But the mistletoe is so small and innocent a thing that I felt it superfluous to ask it for an oath. What harm could it do to my son?" Immediately upon hearing this, Loki departed, located the mistletoe, carved a spear out of it, and brought it to where the gods were playing their new favorite game.
You must feel quite left out, having to sit back here away from the merriment, not being given a chance to show Baldur the honor of proving his invincibility.
The blind god concurred.
Here, I will point your hand in the direction where Baldur stands, and you throw this branch at him.
So hard threw the mistletoe, it pierced the god straight through, and he fell down dead on the spot. The gods found themselves unable to speak as they trembled with anguish and fear. They knew that this event was the first presage of Ragnarok, the downfall and death, not just of themselves, but of the very cosmos they maintained. At last Frigg composed herself enough to ask if there were any among them who were brave, loyal and compassionate enough to journey to the land of the dead and offer Hel, the death goddess, a ransom for Baldur's release. Hermod, an obscure son of Odin, offered to undertake this mission. Odin instructed Sleipnir to bear Hermod to the underworld, and off he went. The gods arranged a lavish funeral for their fallen friend. They turned Baldur's ship, Hrungnir, into a pyre fitting for a great king. When the time came to launch the ship out to sea, however, the gods found the ship stuck in the sand and themselves unable to force it to budge. After many failed attempts, they summoned the brawniest being in the cosmos, a certain giantess named Hrungnir. Hrungnir arrived in Asgard riding a wolf and using poisonous snakes for reins. She dismounted, walked to the prow of the ship, and gave it such a mighty push that the land quaked as Hrungnir was freed from the strand. As Baldur's body was carried onto the ship, his wife Nanna was overcome with such great grief that she died there on the spot and was placed on the pyre alongside her husband. The fire was kindled, and Thor hallowed the flames by holding his hammer over them. Odin laid upon the pyre his ring Draupnir, and Baldur's horse was led into the flames. All kinds of beings from throughout the 9 worlds attended this ceremony: gods, giants, elves, dwarves, valkyries and others. Together they stood and mourned as they watched the burning ship disappear over the ocean. Meanwhile, Hermod rode 9 nights through ever darker and deeper valleys on his quest to rescue the part of Baldur that had been sent to Hel. When he came to the river Gjon, Modgud, the giantess who guards the bridge, asked him his name and his purpose, adding that it was strange that his footfalls were as thundering as those of an entire army, especially since his face still had the color of the living. He answered to her satisfaction, and she allowed him to cross over into Hel's realm. Sleipnir leapt over the wall around that doleful land. Upon entering and dismounting, Hermod spotted Hel's throne and Baldur, pale and downcast, sitting in the seat of honor next to her. Hermod spent the night there, and when morning came, he pleaded with Hel to release his brother, telling her of the great sorrow that all living things, and especially the gods, felt for his absence.
If this is so, then let everything in the cosmos weep for him, and I will send him back to you. But if any refuse, he will remain in my presence.
Hermod rode back to Asgard and told these tidings to the gods, who straightway sent messengers throughout the worlds to bear this news to all of their inhabitants. And indeed, everything did weep for Baldur. Everything, that is, save for one giantess. Tok, who was none other than Loki in another disguise.
Let hell hold what she has.
And so Baldur was condemned to remain in hell's darkness, dampness and cold. Never again would he grace the lands of the living with his gladdening light and exuberance.
Someday, whenever the Norns, those inscrutable spinners of fate, decree it, there shall come a great winter Fimbulwinter, unlike any other the world has yet seen. The biting winds will blow snows from all directions, and the warmth of the sun will fail, plunging the earth into unprecedented cold. This winter shall last for the length of 3 normal winters, with no summers in between. Mankind will become so desperate for food and other necessities of life that all laws and morals will fall away, leaving only the bare struggle for survival. It will be an age of swords and axes. Brother will slay brother, father will slay son, and son will slay father. The wolves Skoll and Hati, who have hunted the sun and the moon through the skies since the beginning of time, will at last catch their prey. The stars too will disappear, leaving nothing but a black void in the heavens. Yggdrasil, the great tree that holds the cosmos together, will tremble, and all the trees and even the mountains will fall to the ground. The chain that has been holding back the monstrous wolf Fenrir will snap, and the beast will run free. Jormungand, the mighty serpent who dwells at the bottom of the ocean and encircles the land, will rise from the depths, spilling the seas over all the earth as he makes landfall. These convulsions will shake the ship Naglfar free from its moorings. This ship, which is made from the fingernails and toenails of dead men and women, will sail easily over the flooded earth. Its crew will be an army of giants, the forces of chaos and destruction, and its captain will be none other than Loki, the traitor to the gods, who will have broken free of the chains in which the gods have bound him. Fenrir, with fire blazing from his eyes and nostrils, will run across the earth with his lower jaw on the ground and his upper jaw against the top of the sky, devouring everything in his path. Jormungand will spit his venom over all the world, poisoning land, water and air alike. The dome of the sky will be split, and from the crack shall emerge the fire giants from Muspelheim. Their leader shall be Surt, with a flaming sword brighter than the sun in his hand. As they march across Bifrost, the rainbow bridge to Asgard, the home of the gods, the bridge will break and fall behind them. An ominous horn blast will ring out. This will be Heimdall, the divine sentry, blowing the Gjalla horn to announce the arrival of the moment the gods have feared. Odin will anxiously consult the head of Ymir, the wisest of all beings, for counsel. The gods will decide to go to battle, even though they know what the prophecies have foretold concerning the outcome of this clash. They will arm themselves and meet their enemies on a battlefield called Vigrid. Odin will fight Fenrir, and by his side will be the Einherjar, the host of his chosen human warriors, whom he has kept in Valhalla for just this moment. Odin and the champions of men will fight more valiantly than anyone has ever fought before, but it will not be enough. Fenrir will swallow Odin and his men. Then one of Odin's sons, Vidar, burning with rage, will charge the beast to avenge his father. On one of his feet will be the shoe that has been crafted for this very purpose. It has been made from all the scraps of leather that human shoemakers have ever discarded. With it, Vidar will hold open the monster's mouth. Then he will stab his sword through the wolf's throat, killing him. Another wolf, Garm, and the god Tyr will slay each other. Heimdall and Loki will do the same, putting a final end to the trickster's treachery, but costing the gods one of their best in the process. The god Freyr and the giant Surt will also be the end of each other. Thor and Jormungand, those age-old foes, will both finally have their chance to kill the other. Thor will succeed in felling the great snake with the blows of his hammer, but the serpent will have covered him in so much venom that he will not be able to stand for much longer. He will take 9 paces before falling dead himself and adding his blood to the already saturated soil of Vigrid. Then the remains of the world will sink into the sea, and there will be nothing left but the void. Creation, and all that has occurred since, will be completely undone, as if it had never happened. Some say that that is the end of the tale, and of all tales for that matter. But others hold that a new world, green and beautiful, will arise out of the waters. Vidar and a few other gods, Vali, Baldur, Hodor and Thor's sons Modi and Magni, will survive the downfall of the old world and will live joyously in the new one. A man and a woman, Lif and Lifthraso, will have hidden themselves from the cataclysm in a place called the Wood of Hrungnir, and will now come out and populate the lush land in which they will find themselves. A new sun, the daughter of the previous one, will rise in the sky, and all of this will be presided over by a new, almighty ruler.